In 2021, California surfing school owner Matthew Taylor Coleman confessed to murdering his 2 children. Coleman confessed to authorities that he was convinced that his children, aged 2 years old and 10 months old, would grow up into horrific monsters. Coleman believed that his wife had passed serpent DNA to them at childbirth. His wife had contacted Santa Barbara police that her husband had ran off with the children, but it was too late. Sadly, Coleman had taken them into Mexico and used a spear fishing gun to stop this alleged serpent DNA from producing reptilians. Though viewed as science fiction by the news media, Coleman was but one member of a larger group of people in the United States who shared his belief in the serpent DNA theory. Just a few months prior, in December 2020, Quinn Warner detonated a recreational vehicle parked on 2nd Avenue North in downtown Nashville. The blast radius was massive. It damaged 41 buildings when his RV exploded on Christmas Day. Prior to the detonation, Warner had made statements about a conspiracy that lizard people would soon take over the planet. After it was learned that the January 6th Capitol rioters were linked to the notorious anonymous group known as Q, researchers began to investigate the group and publish some of the conspiracy theories, fueling the plots carried out by its members. What they found was disturbing. The serpent DNA theory was just one of the conspiracy theories, and the rioters and terror groups were only a small part of the Q network. Researchers identified another, much larger and very disturbing group of people: Evangelicals. A growing number of evangelical Christians were adopting QAnon theories as part of their own plot to eradicate unbelievers from the United States government and establish a theocracy. Some researchers noticed many similarities between the doctrines of these Evangelicals and the Christian identity doctrines described by Michael Barkun in his book, Religion and the Racist Right: The Origins of the Christian Identity Movement. How did the serpent DNA theory find its way into evangelical Christianity? When did Christian ministers begin to adopt conspiracy theories as part of their Sunday sermons? To find out, we must examine one peculiar conspiracy theory that was used to transition British Israelism into Christian identity, and how it found its way into the latter rain movement, which would lay the foundation for the NAR. When the British Israel Doctrine was infused with the racially charged politics of the late 1800s in the United States, the racial aspects of the doctrine were amplified. Leaders in the movement began to follow the doctrine to its logical conclusion. If the white-skinned people of the British Isles and the United States were the descendants of the biblical Israel, people with non-white skin were not. Passages from the Old Testament that described God's blessings to Israel were already included in the British Israel Doctrine. What about the other passages from the Old Testament that described foreign nations? If Israel was to be blessed while other nations were cursed, what was their ancestry? One of the earliest attempts to solve this puzzle within British Israelism is found in the writings of Russell Kelso Carter. Carter was a graduate of the Pennsylvania Military Academy. He held a degree in civil engineering and taught science and chemistry at the academy until 1872. After resigning, Carter was ordained a Methodist minister and eventually became a Church of God Holiness minister, prolific author, and songwriter. He penned the words and music for 52 hymns, including the 1885 hymn, Standing on the Promises. Carter also authored books on Christian holiness, faith healing, and British Israelism. His doctrines on faith healing influenced E.W. Kenyon, leading to the development of the Word of Faith theology. He also collaborated with A.B. Simpson and the Christian and Missionary Alliance, preaching at many of the CMA conventions until the group rejected Pentecostalism and Carter separated from them. In 1894, Carter published his book, The Tree of Knowledge, which played a key role in the development of the two-seed doctrine in British Israelism. According to Carter, quote, "The tremendous pull of the sexual appetite, aroused by the excited state of the woman, caused the downfall of the human race in the Garden of Eden." The result, according to Carter, was Cain, who Carter believed to be the literal son of the biblical serpent. Carter asserted that the British Israelites were descendants of the so-called righteous seed through Adam, while all non-British Israelites were descended from the so-called serpent seed through the serpent's sexual affair with Eve. Carter believed the serpent of Eden was Satan, who sought to destroy God's pure race, quote, at its fountainhead. The title of Carter's book refers to a passage from the 2nd chapter in the book of Genesis that reads, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." In the biblical narrative, the serpent from the Garden of Eden beguiled Eve to eat of the fruit, meaning charmed or enchanted to deceive her, leading to the downfall of the human race. This account in Genesis is referred to as the original sin. In the Tree of Knowledge, Carter diverged from many other Christian scholars who believed that the biblical serpent was possessed by Satan. Carter believed that, quote, Satan cohabited with Eve, teaching her how to secure pleasure when the natural time had not fully come. In other words, Carter believed that the original sin was sex. This assertion introduced the idea that the original sin was rooted in racial impurity, leading his readers to conclude that the political turmoil was the result of an impure race. Most Christians interpreted the Genesis account of Eve disobeying God by eating fruit, literally. For mainstream Christianity, introducing sex between Eve and the serpent into the narrative also introduced implications of sexual innuendo, considered heretical. Though its integration into British Israelism was a new concept, the idea of a sexual union between Eve and the serpent did not originate with Carter. In fact, it was declared to be a heresy by the first Christian apologist, Irenaeus, in the 2nd century. In his book, Against Heresies, Irenaeus linked this belief to those of the Gnostics. The notion of sex generating both a good force and an evil force within ancient mythologies was fairly common. However, according to Irenaeus, the introduction of pagan myths into Christianity was deemed heretical. This heresy had made its way into American Christianity in the 19th century through the doctrine of Daniel Parker. Parker was a Baptist preacher who believed in predestination, the divine foreordaining of all that will happen. He became very militant in his position on predestination when he introduced the two-seed doctrine into his theology and declared that some people simply could not be saved due to their lineage. In 1826, Parker published Views of the Two Seeds, a pamphlet describing the ancient heresy. Those of the so-called good seed, or the elect, could be saved, while those of the so-called bad seed, the non-elect, could not. According to Parker's theology, any attempt to share the gospel with the non-elect would be fruitless. Parker spread this belief among the primitive Baptists, or two-seed in the spirit predestinarian Baptists, which numbered almost 13,000 in 1890. Parker's pamphlet predated the spreading of British Israelism in the United States by over half a century. As a result, when British Israelism adopted the two-seed doctrine, it was already compatible within many Christian groups that believed in predestination. When the two-seed doctrine merged with British Israelism and the more militant Anglo-Saxonism doctrines, it formed a very deadly combination, both politically and religiously, and sometimes physically. While British Israelism was primarily focused on the blessings for God's chosen people, the two-seed doctrine brought attention to God's enemies. Adding Anglo-Saxonism to the mix empowered British Israel leaders to develop doctrines claiming that the elect were destined to rule over the non-elect. Had it been introduced initially within the British Israel framework, this would have been purely anti-Semitic. However, in the racially charged political battlefield of the late 1800s and early 1900s in the United States, it evolved into a blend of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Worse, as the doctrine transitioned to align with white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, all groups targeted by the Klan, such as Catholics, were seen as part of the anti-elect agenda. By the 1930s, the most extreme versions of British Israelism saw this agenda as a war against the elect. Enemies of white supremacy groups were deemed soldiers enlisted by Satan himself. As Michael Barkun notes, this is the most distinctive doctrine of the Christian identity movement and the premise for the group's demonization of the Jews in the later years. Barkun also noted that this doctrine originated from individuals lacking a solid understanding of theology or Christian history. While Irenaeus noted the existence of this doctrine in the early Christian centuries, there is no evidence that the British Israel movement directly used those sources. Regardless, the eventual interpretation of the doctrine within the British Israel movement closely resembled ancient Gnostic versions. According to both interpretations, Satan impregnated Eve with the purest form of evil to produce Cain. In both interpretations, the Jews emerged from Cain's bloodline. The Christian identity movement took this a step further when it associated Cain's so-called evil seed with the non-white races. This premise became the cornerstone of the Christian identity movement, with its leaders identifying with the elect seed and positioning it as true Christianity, while labeling other non-white supremacy branches of the Christian faith as evil villains. The doctrine continued to develop well into the 1960s during the height of the Latter Rain movement. George Hawtin, one of the founding members of the Sharon Orphanage from which the Latter Rain movement originated after the Latter Rain revival, was prolific in spreading all elements of British Israelism, Anglo-Saxonism, and the two-seed doctrines. According to Hawtin, quote, "Blacks were created in God's wisdom to serve whites." It was not until 1989 that Hawtin retracted his statements, and only after complaints were filed with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. William Branham, leader of the Latter Rain and voice of healing revivals, officially introduced the doctrine in his 1958 sermon, The Serpent Seed, as, quote, "a recent revelation," but unofficially taught the doctrine throughout his recorded ministry. He was first introduced to the doctrine in the Pentecostal Baptist Church of God sect, led by white supremacy leader Roy Davis. Davis was formerly the second-in-command of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan under William Joseph Simmons, and the official spokesperson for the group in 1923. Branham taught the two-seed doctrine throughout his recorded ministry, though somewhat covertly, until the Christian identity movement went public with the doctrine in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Why were religious leaders of that era compelled to consider William Branham to be the leader of the post-World War II healing revivals, knowing his views on Christian identity and the serpent's DNA? How did that belief impact the end-time revival doctrines of the NAR? To find out, we must dig even deeper into the Azusa Street revival.